Masechet Chagigah, we're going to learn Chagigah Daf. We're going to start on the last line of Daf Yomi Shiur. Says the Gemara, and this takes us back to the Mishnah on Daf Yomi Shiur. The Mishnah says on Daf Yomi Shiur, the first Mishnah, that a child who's old enough to be educated, his father should take him up to the Beis Hamikdash, aliyah l'regel. And there's a machlekes in the Mishnah, how old is that child, that he's actually old enough or mature enough that he should be taken to aliyah l'regel. Says the Mishnah, Eizeu Kotten, who is a child who is old enough who is young enough to not to have to come up to aliyah l'regel. Kol she'eino yochid lirkov al kseifav shel aviv v'lalos miYerushalayim lahar habayis divrei Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai say that if the child is not old enough that he can be carried on his father's shoulders from Yerushalayim up to the Har Habayis, to the Beis Hamikdash, then he's too young and does not need to be taken. That's divrei Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel oimrim, Beis Hillel argue and say, Kol she'eino yochid lechuz biyodei shel aviv v'lalos miYerushalayim lahar habayis. It's not good enough that the father can actually carry the child. That wouldn't be old enough. The child has to be old enough to be able to hold his father's hand and walk with him from Yerushalayim up the Har Habayis, up the Temple Mount to the Beis Hamikdash. That means he doesn't have to be able to walk on his own. He does have to be able to hold his father's hand and go up to the Har Habayis. Says the Gemara, Maskif lo Reb Zera. Reb Zera is now asking a question. Ad hocha man asya. Who brought this child till Yerushalayim? It could be this family were living far away from Yerushalayim, and you're saying that if the child can hold his father's hands from Yerushalayim to Har Habayis, then you have to take him. The question is that every single child that got from wherever his home is till Yerushalayim is clearly old enough that he can hold his father's hands and walk up from Yerushalayim up to the Har Habayis. If he can manage without his mother for that length of time, then of course he's old enough. So what does it mean that you've got this condition that he has to be able, if he can hold his father's hand, then he can go up? Well, there's no child that got to Yerushalayim that can't do that. Omar le Abaye. Abaye said no. Ad hocha de mechayve imei besimcha aisise imei. No. Because till Yerushalayim, the mother had to come. It's true we saw in the Mishnah that a woman doesn't have to come to the Beis Hamikdash. She hasn't got a chiyuv of re'iyah. But nonetheless, she has to come to Yerushalayim because she has to be besimcha. The pasuk says, "V'samachta ato beischa." She's got to come with the husband to Yerushalayim to be happy there on Yom Tov by eating the basar shlomim, the flesh of the korban shlomim. She doesn't need to go up to Har Habayis. So if you're asking how the child could get there, the mother had to get to Yerushalayim. Now that the whole family are in Yerushalayim, the question is the child old enough to be able to be taken to the Har Habayis? And that's the discussion. Mikan ve'elach, from Yerushalayim up to the Beis Hamikdash, im yochei la'alois v'lechos biyodei shel aviv miYerushalayim lahar habayis chayev. If he can hold his father's hand and do that walk, then he's chayev. The father's chayev to take him. Ve'iloi potur, and if not, then he's too young and doesn't need to go up with the father. Continues the Gemara, Heishiv Rabbi Tachas Beis Hillel. Rabbi is now asking a question against Beis Shammai. Ledivrei Beis Shammai is asking a question in the place of Beis Hillel. Whereas Beis Hillel could have and maybe should have asked this question against Beis Shammai, Rabbi is asking this question. What's the question? From a pasuk in Shmuel. It says, V'chano loy also, that Elkanah, who's Chano's wife, Shmuel's father, he went up to do aliyah l'regel, and Chano didn't go up to do aliyah l'regel. Ki omra leisha, she said to her husband, Ad yigomei lanar, our little Shmuel, the little child, till he becomes 2 years old, he's not yet filled and reached the end of his second year. He still hasn't been weaned, and therefore I'll wait till then, ve'evesiv, and then I will bring him to Yerushalayim. The question is that over there was no Beis Hamikdash yet. It was before the time of the Beis Hamikdash. Instead of the Beis Hamikdash, they had the Mishkan. And the Mishkan was in Shiloh. Now, assuming that she had to come to, she was in Shiloh, she had to come to Shiloh because she has to be there for the Simcha. And once you're in Shiloh, just to go to the Mishkan with Shmuel's father, with Elkanah, what would have been the problem with that? Shmuel, this little child, he was just under 2 years old. He could have been carried on his father's shoulders, and just to go from Shiloh to the Mishkan Shiloh, why not? According to Beis Shammai, maybe he couldn't walk on his own, but definitely according to Beis Shammai, and where Beis Shammai says you have to be able to, it's enough to be able to carry him to the Beis Hamikdash stroke Mishkan. Why was she exempt? Says the Gemara Omar Lei. So the answer to the question against Beis Shammai is that Omar Lei Avua, the father of Rabbi, answered Rabbi's question, Le Tamech. According to you, Rabbi, you're trying to bring proof from here, like Beis Hillel, that it's not good enough that you can actually carry him on your shoulders. He has to be able to walk. I'll ask you another question. What exempted Chana from actually coming to Shiloh? She had to be there for the Simcha. Elo, the reason that Chana herself didn't go up to Shiloh, that means that of course had she come to Shiloh, you'd have a good question. He's old enough to be able to be carried up. He was just under 2 years old, that's fine. But Chana didn't even come to Shiloh. Why? Elo Chana mifankusa yoseres echazia baby Shmuel. Chana, she saw in Shmuel he was very pampered and very delicate. And she was afraid that the exhaustion of the way would be more than he could handle, and therefore she didn't take him to Shiloh. And for that same reason, there was no chiyuv of chinuch here, and he couldn't be left and taken up to the Mishkan in Shiloh. Continues the Gemara. Boyer Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon asked the following question: Chiger, a cotton chiger. If you have a minor who's lame, he can't walk properly. Ledivrei Beis Shammai. According to Beis Shammai, who says that the child who's old enough that he can be carried from the Yerushalayim to the Har HaBayis, the one's required to do so. This chiger, this lame child, it's true that Beis Hillel, who says you have to be able to walk up by holding his father's hands, this child can't walk, he's lame. But according to Beis Shammai, that it's enough that you can carry the child. Why can't you carry the child? So he's lame, put him on your shoulders and carry him up. So a child who's able to be carried up, but he can't walk himself, is one required to take him up to Aliyah L'Regel. Another question, Vesuma, and a blind child, L'Divrei Shneim, even according to Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, according to both of them, if you've got a child who's blind, but he could walk up with holding his father's hand, and he can be carried up. According to Beis Shammai, he can be carried up. According to Beis Hillel, he can hold his father's hand and go up to Yerushalayim. Mahu, is the father required to take him up to the Beis HaMikdash? Says the Gemara, Heichadami. Let's try and understand what case is the question. Are we talking about a type of person who's lame, he cannot walk now, and he's never going to become healed? Vesuma, and a blind child, who's never going to become healed, he'll never be able to see. Then it would seem there's no question. Hashta godil potur cotton miboya. Why do we educate a child before his bar mitzvah? In order that when he gets older, he'll be in the habit of doing the things he's supposed to be doing. But this child after bar mitzvah, he's not required bichlal to do aliyah l'regel because he's not going to be cured. He's always going to be either blind or lame. Then what would be the point of being mechanachim, of educating him? Says the Gemara Loi. We're talking about a child who can actually get healed. And a blind person, a blind child who's actually going to be able to see when he's an older. Tosfos says he's going to get healed even before his bar mitzvah. So that's the question. Do we say that since now he's blind or lame, and anyone who's blind and lame is exempt from the mitzvah? Or do we say no? Chinuch is there to train him for when he's older. When he's older, hopefully he'll be healed and he will be required. So there's a chiyuv of chinuch. Omar Abaya said that you do not have to take him up. Kol heichad de godel mechayev, any child who's in a situation that besides for his age, if he were old enough, he would be chayev midiraisa, would be chayev minatayra to do something, then midirabonon, we have to educate him even as a child. But a child who's in a situation that were he a godel, he would not be chayev, like this child who at the moment is either lame or blind. Midirabonon, koton nami potur, then midrabanon, then one is not required to educate him and to take him to aliyah l'regel. Continues the Gemara. And this takes us to the end of the Mishnah, Daf Beis Amud Aleph. The Mishnah is discussing that we're going to learn that over Yom Tov there are three korbanos. There's the Oilas Re'iyah, coming to the Beis Hamikdash. You're not allowed to come without a korban Oilah called Oilas Re'iyah. And then you've got the Shalmei Chagigah. You have to bring, because it's Yom Tov, you have to bring a korban Shlomim Chagigah. And also there's going to be Shalmei Simcha, that if you haven't got other korbanos that you can eat to give you happiness over Yom Tov, you have to eat from Shalmei Simcha, which we'll discuss. The question is, these animals, these korbanos, and the Mishnah is primarily discussing only the Oilas Re'iyah and the Shalmei Chagigah. What's the minimum value they have to be worth or cost to fulfill your requirement? Beis Shammai oimrim ha're'iyah, the Oilas Re'iyah, shtei kesef. It has to be worth 2 silver coins. V'chagigah ma'o kesef. But the Shalmei Chagigah, it's good enough that it's 1 ma', 1 silver coin. Or Beis Hillel oimrim, Beis Hillel say the opposite. They say ha're'iyah ma'o kesef, the korban oilah, it's enough if it's worth just 1 ma'. V'chagigah shtei kesef, and the korban chagigah has to be worth 2 silver coins. We're going to discuss that now. So we have here a machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Which one is, so to speak, more prominent, the more important one, the more expensive one? Beis Shammai says it's the korban oilah, and Beis Hillel say it's the korban chagigah. Tanu Rabbanon. Beis Shammai oimrim ha're'iyah, the korban oilas re'iyah, shtei kesef, v'chagigah mo kesef. Why? So the Brisa says, she'ha're'iyah oile kula legavoya. Since it's a korban oilah, and there's something very unique about korban oilah, and that is that unlike other korbanos that gets eaten by kohanim, by the owners, the korban oilah completely goes on the mizbeach, so to speak, it's completely for Hashem. And therefore, says Beis Shammai, a korban oilah has to be worth more. Masha'en kein b'chagigah. In contrast to the Shalmei Chagigah, that's not completely to the mizbeach. V'oid, another point, motzinu ba'atzeres. If you look at the psukim on the korbanos of Shavuos, if you look in the psukim there, you'll see by the oilos that together with the shtei alechem, they would bring 7 lambs and a par and 2 elim, 2 rams as an oilah. And for shlomim, they would only bring the 2 lambs. So we see that in the korbanos of Shavuos, there were many more korban oilos than korban shlomim. So you see that oilah is more prominent. Therefore, regarding the Oilas Re'iyah and the Shalmei Chagigah, says Beis Shammai, the Oilas Re'iyah has to be worth more than the korban Chagigah. Or Beis Hillel oimrim, Beis Hillel argue and say no. Ha're'iyah ma'o kesef v'chagigah shtei kesef. The Chagigah has to be worth at least double of the minimum value of the Oilah. Shechagigah yeshno lifnei adibur. Because the korban Chagigah, it was actually there, it applied, they brought it, it was a korban that was offered even before Matan Torah. Masha'en kein b're'iyah. But the oilah, there was no oilas re'iyah before Matan Torah, before we got the Torah, and that gives prominence to the korban chagigah, and therefore the chagigah has to be worth more. V'oid motzinu also b'nesiim, when they inaugurated the Mishkan the first time, and the nesiim, the 12 nesiim from the Shvatim would bring their korbanos, sheribo b'hen hakosov b'shlomim, yosim b'oilos. If you look in the psukim there, you'll see that the nesiim brought many more shlomim than they brought oilos. So you see that the shlomim has prominence over oilah, and therefore says Beis Hillel that the shlomim has to be worth 2 silver coins, and the oilah it's enough if it's worth just 1. Now the Gemara is going to discuss how they explain and refute each other's opinions. Beis Hillel ma'itama le'omro keBeis Shammai. Why did Beis Hillel not hear Beis Shammai's train of thought? Says the Gemara, the Ka'omras, because you Beis Shammai, you said the re'iyah adifa, that the korban oilah, the oilas re'iyah is preferable, it's got to be more expensive. The oilah kula legavoya, because the oilah goes completely on the mizbeach, and that's why you Beis Shammai explained why the oilah has to be at least double of the minimum of a shlomim. Adarab, on the contrary, says Beis Hillel, chagigah adifa. I think that that's the very reason that the chagigah is preference. Because there are 2, so to speak, entities who are eating from it. The korban oilah, only the mizbeach is eating it. The korban shlomim, it's also the mizbeach and also the people, and that gives it more prominence. Udeka'omrus, and your second claim, Beis Shammai, that neilif me'atzeres, that from the korbanos of Shavuos, we see with the shtei alechem, you see there were more oilos than shlomim, then donin korban yochid mi korban yochid. we're discussing here the Oilas Re'iyah and the Shalmei Chagigah, which are private korbanis. They are paid for by the individual. So we'd rather learn that from the korbanis of the Nesiim, which were private korbanis. Ve'in don in korban yochid mi korban tzibur, and we'd rather not learn the halachas of Oilas Re'iyah and Shalmei Chagigah from the korbanis of Shavuos, which are communal korbanis. They were korbanis that were paid for by the treasury of the public money. Ubeshamai maitam lo omri k'Beis Hillel. Why did Beis Shammai not hear Beis Hillel's claims? So he says as follows: the Ka'omras Chagigah Adif, for this that you Beis Hillel said that Chagigah is more the Yeshna Lifnei Adibur, because it was there before Matan Torah. Re'iyah nami Yeshna Lifnei Adibur. There's sources also, we're going to see about that soon. But even the Korban Oila, and the Korban Oila also was brought before Matan Torah. And we'll have to see what they're arguing about. We'll come back to that. Or the Ka'omras and Beis Hillel, who said Neilef min Nesiim, that from the Nesiim you see they brought more Shlomim than Oila. He says Donin Dava Hanoyeg L'Doiros. Beis Shammai claim, I'd rather learn Shalmei Chagigah and Oilas Re'iyah midava hanoyeg l'doiros, from the Shtei Alechem, from the Karbonos of Shavuos, which are brought through the generations, like Oilas Re'iyah and Shalmei Chagigah. Ve'in donin dava hanoyeg l'doiros midava she'einu noyeg l'doiros, and I'd rather not learn the halachas of Shalmei Chagigah and Oilas Re'iyah, which applies to all the generations, from the Nesiim that doesn't apply in the future. It just happened once, and therefore that was an exception. And we don't want to learn from an exception. Says the Gemara, Beis Hillel, it would seem that Beis Shammai is right, because the Pasuk does say regarding the before Matan Torah, it says, Vayishlach esnari b'nei Yisrael, vayalu oilos, vayizbechu zvachim shlomim l'Hashem porim. So, of course they brought shlomim, it says in the Pasuk, but it also says vayalu oilos. So that's what Beis Shammai's claim against Beis Hillel was, that you Beis Hillel are giving preference to Shlomim. Because Shlomim was there before Matan Torah, so was Oila. Beis Hillel ma'ishno Chagigah de yeshno lifnei adibur. Beis Hillel, what's their source that there was a korban Shlomim which is called Chagigah? Why is it called Chagigah? Because they actually told Pari, we're going ve'yachoigu, we're going to the desert. We want to go to the desert to bring Chagigah. So the Karbonos were called a Chagigah. The Yeshna Lifnei Adibur. It was there before Matan Torah. Tichsiv, as it says, the pasuk we just quoted, Vayizbechu Zvachim Shlomim. Re'iyah nami Oksiv, but in the same pasuk it says regarding the Oila, it says Vayalu Oilos. And we assume that those Oilos are somewhat considered an Oilas Re'iyah. They brought the Karbonis because of the Shechina that was there. Answers the Gemara, Kasavra Beis Hillel, Oila shekrivu Yisrael b'midbar Oilas Tomid Havoi. Beis Hillel holds that Oila was not an Oilas Re'iyah. It was the daily, regular Korban Tomid, which was also an Oila. And therefore it's not relevant to this discussion. So Shlomim, which are called Chagigah, was brought before Matan Torah. Oilas Re'iyah was not brought. The Oila there was not an Oilas Re'iyah, it was an Oilas Tomid, and therefore that's what Beis Hillel hold. Or Beis Shammai Savra, and that's where Beis Shammai argue with Beis Hillel. And Beis Shammai say that when it says in the pasuk Vayalu Oilos, they hold Oila shekrivu Yisrael b'midbar, that Oila that was brought in the desert by Klal Yisrael, Oilas Re'iyah Havoi. It wasn't referring to the Oilas Tomid, it was referring to the Oilas Re'iyah. And therefore Beis Shammai say that there's no preference of Shlomim over the Shalmei Chagigah, over the Oilas Re'iyah, from the fact that it was before Matan Torah, because the Oilas Re'iyah was also before Matan Torah. Omar Rabbi. Rabbi is now going to make an interesting statement, and then the Gemara is going to prove it, and it's going to explain it. Omar Rabbi, Beis Shammai, V'Rebbe Lazar, V'Rebbe Shmuel, 3 Tanoim, Kulu Sviru Luhu, they all hold Oila shekrivu Yisrael b'midbar. This that it says in the pasuk Vayalu Oilos, what does it mean? Oilas Re'iyah Havoyu. It was actually an Oilas Re'iyah, as it says Vayechazu Elo Elikim. They brought it because of the vision they had of the Shechina. It was considered an Oilas Re'iyah. And we saw Beis Shammai, we just saw now. Beis Hillel, V'Rebbe Akiva, V'Rebbe Yossi Aglili, those 3 Tanoim hold Kulu Sviru Luhu, Oilo shekrivu Yisrael b'midbar, Oilas Tomid Havoi. And since it was an Oilas Tomid, it wasn't an Oilas Re'iyah. And Beis Hillel we just saw, since it wasn't an Oilas Re'iyah, so they only brought the Korban Chagigah, the Shalmei Chagigah, and not the Oilas Re'iyah. Beis Hillel brought proof from there that we give preference to the Shalmei Chagigah over the Oilas Re'iyah, at least regarding its value. So Beis Shammai, we're going to go one by one. We're starting with the list of the 3 Tanoim who hold that when it says in the Pasuk, Vayalu Oilos, it was talking about Oilas Re'iyah. Number 1 is Beis Shammai. Like we just saw, that's how Beis Shammai refuted Beis Hillel. Rabbi Shmuel, where do we see that Rabbi Shmuel says that? To Tanya, we learned in the Brayso, Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Klolus nemru b'Sinai, uprotus bo'el moed. Rabbi Shmuel says that the generalizations that were given at Sinai were not given with the details, and the details were only given later in the Ohel Moed. Rabbi Akiva argues and says that whenever the generalizations were given, the details were given with it. You cannot give a mitzvah without telling us the details of how to keep the mitzvah. He says, Klolos uprotus nemru b'Sinai. It's true that in the Chumash it's only recorded some of the generalizations. However, the details were also given at Sinai. V'nishnu b'Ohel Moed. When in the Ohel Moed the Torah tells us about the details that were given, then the rules, the generalizations, and the details were given again in the Ohel Moed. V'nishtalshlu, and a third time it was given ba'arvos Moav, at the end of the 40 years, where Moshe Rabbeinu again repeated the Torah, the klolim with the protim. Now the Gemara is going to bring the proof. V'yisol k'daitach, if you're going to say that oilo she'ekrivu Yisrael b'midbar, that the korban oilo that was actually brought before Matan Torah, before the details were given in Ohel Moed, and you're going to say oilas tomid avoy, you're going to say it was an oilas tomid, we have a problem. Mi'ika midi, is it possible that this very same korban tomid, that before Ohel Moed, we didn't know the details of skinning the oilah, the tomid, and cutting it into its relevant pieces? We didn't know that because those are details, and those details are only told to us in the Ohel Moed. Could it be they brought a korban oilah, the oilas tomid, without knowing that how to do it, and only lebesayf, and only much later in the Ohel Moed, boye hefshev v'nituach, they were suddenly told how to do the korban tomid? It cannot be. So according to Rabbi Akiva, it's no problem. The details were given. Whenever the rules were given, the details were given. If it was at Matan Torah or before Matan Torah, that's a discussion. But whenever there was a korban tomid, they knew exactly how to do it with the details. It's only according to Rabbi Shmuel who says that the details were not given, it cannot be a korban tomid. So which oilah was it? It must be that it was just an oilas re'iyah, and that's not something the Torah told them to bring. It's something they brought on their own accord. They brought it on their own accord, so the details didn't really matter that much. So that's a proof that according to Rabbi Shmuel, the oilah that was brought must be, it was not the oilas tomid, it must be, it was the oilas re'iyah. Rabbi Lazar, the third Tana who says it was an oilas re'iyah, is the Rabbi Lazar. The Tanya, we learned in a Brayso, where the Pasuk says oilas tomid, the korban oilas tomid, and it's explicit mention of the tomid. Ha'asuya b'Har Sinai, that was done, that was made at Har Sinai, l'reach nichoyach ishe l'Hashem. So says the Rabbi Lazar Omer, Maseo nemru b'Sinai. When it says oilas tomid ha'asuya, it doesn't mean that it was actually done at Sinai. No, it means that it was spoken about. The concept of a korban tomid was told to them at Sinai. V'hi atzmo lo yikarva. But the korban tomid itself was not actually brought up. Why? Why was the korban tomid not brought up? Because we didn't know the details yet. So how are they going to explain the pasuk that says that they brought the oilos, the vayalu oilos? It must be, it was an oilas re'iyah, not the korban tomid. That's Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Akiva argues, Omer, korva, the korban tomid itself was offered up, and this is consistent with what we saw Rabbi Akiva at the top of the Amud, who says that the details were given together with the generalizations. So whenever they heard about the korban tomid, they heard the details, and they could well have brought the korban tomid even before Arvis Moav, even before the Ohel Moed. V'shuvlai Pascha, Rabbi Akiva says they started at Sinai bringing the korban tomid, and they never stopped. Says the Gemara, you, Rabbi Akiva, you just said now that they brought the korban tomid from Sinai and they never stopped bringing it. Elomani Mekayim, how are you going to understand the pasuk in Amos? The pasuk says, Hazvachim umincha higashtem li b'midbar arbaim shana beis Yisrael. In the desert, did you offer up the korbanos in the desert? Rabbi Akiva just said they brought up the korbanos and they never stopped. Says the Gemara, what the Pasuk means is the rest of Klal Yisrael. Because the rest of Klal Yisrael were in some form of excommunication, and therefore they were Nazifa, they didn't bring Korbanos. However, Shivtoi Shel Levi, it was the Shevet Levi, Shelayovdu Avodah Zarah, they didn't serve the Egel, they had no part in the Avodah Zarah. Heinikrivu Isa, they brought the Korbanos, those korbanos from their money, these oilos that Rabbi Akiva was talking about, that they started bringing at Sinai and never stopped, that was the Leviim themselves who brought the korban tamid from their money, and that's what Rabbi Akiva was referring to. So we've seen now 3 Tanoim who say that the oila that was brought before Matan Torah was the oilas re'iyah, not the oilas tamid. Bis Hillel. Now we're going to the other list, with the 3 Tanoim who say that the korban oila was actually the oilas tamid, not the oilas re'iyah. Bis Hillel, Hada Omron. We saw Bis Hillel said on Amud Aleph that the reason that the korban Chagigah has to be worth more than the oilas re'iyah is because there was no oilas re'iyah before Matan Torah. So which oila was there? The oilas tamid. Rabbi Akiva. What's Rabbi Akiva? Hada Omron. We've just mentioned him at the top of the Amud. It says that Klalos upratos nemru, and Rabbi Akiva says that was the first Rabbi Akiva. The second Rabbi Akiva we saw says that Korva, they actually brought the korban. Says explicitly they brought the korban tamid in Sinai already. So we've seen that. Who's the third Tana? Rabbi Yossi Aglili. The Tanya Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer. Shalosh mitzvos nitztavu Yisrael baloisam l'regel. Klal Yisrael, when they came up to the Beis Hamikdash to do the mitzvah of Aliyah l'regel, they had to do 3 mitzvahs. Number 1, Re'iyah, they had to come and be seen and see the Beis Hamikdash and bring the oilas Re'iyah. Number 2, the Chagigah, they had to bring the Shalmei Chagigah. And 3 is the V'simcha, to be happy, and being happy is only by eating korbanos. They would offer Shalmei Simcha. And there's something unique about all 3. Yesh b're'iyah she'ein b'shteim. There's something unique about the oilas re'iyah, which the other 2 korbanos don't have. V'yesh b'chagigah she'ein b'shteim. There's something unique about the korban chagigah. V'yesh b'simcha she'ein b'shteim. And there's something unique about simcha that the others don't have. Yesh b're'iyah she'ein b'shteim. What's unique about the oilas re'iyah? She're'iyah oila kula l'gavoya. That the korban oilas re'iyah is a korban oila. The korban oila goes completely on the mizbeach. That's unique about the korban oila. Masheikin b'shteim, the other 2, the Shalmei Chagigah and Shalmei Simcha, are korban shlomim. Korban shlomim doesn't go entirely on the mizbeach. Yesh b'chagigah mashein b'shteim. What's unique about Chagigah? Shechagigah yesh no lifnei adibur. Because the korban Chagigah, as Bisel said before, the korban Chagigah was brought before Matan Torah. As we saw before that they brought vayizbechu zvachim shlomim l'Hashem porim, and the pasuk says that they told Pari vayochaygu li b'midbar that the korbanos are referred to. It wasn't Yom Tov, but it's referred to as a Chagigah. So the korban Chagigah is unique in as much as it was there already before Matan Torah. Masheinkin b'shteim, but the oilas re'iyah, as we saw before, that this is going to be the proof that Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds this way, that there was no oilas re'iyah before Matan Torah. It must be the oilah that was brought was the oilas tamid, and that's the proof. That's what we're trying to bring. This is the Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Yesh b'simcha mashein b'shteim. What's unique about simcha? Shesimcha neheges ba'anoshim u'b'noshim masheinkin b'shteim. The Shalmei Chagigah and the oilas re'iyah noshim apotur. However, the simcha noshim achayev, because it says in the pasuk, that you have to be happy, you and your wife and your home, and therefore they have chayev b'simcha. Continues the Gemara. Rabbi Shmuel, you Abaya said, and that's what we're in the middle of learning, that Abaya said that Rabbi Shmuel is one of those who, like Beis Shammai, hold that the oila that was brought in the midbar was an oilas re'iyah, not an oilas tamid. What was the proof? All we know is that Rabbi Shmuel said that the details were not given together with the rules, with the generalizations. So Abaya said that if the korban they brought was the korban tamid, but the details of hefshet v'nituach, how to cut the animal, how to skin the animal, that's something that was only explicitly told to us in the Oyel Moed. So it can't be that they brought a korban tamid. Can it be that they bring a korban tamid without knowing the details and possibly not doing it according to the details and later changing and saying, well, this is the way it should have been done? That was Abaya's proof. And the Gemara is going to challenge that now. What told you that Rabbi Shmuel holds like Beis Shammai and the halacha is never like Beis Shammai? We know that in almost every case, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the halacha is like Beis Hillel, not Beis Shammai. So what was your proof that Rabbi Shmuel holds like Beis Shammai? Just because of that question? You had a question that if the oila that was brought before Sinai was a korban oilas tomid, and you had this question, how can it be that the korban oila that was brought at Sinai before the details were given didn't need to be skinned and cut up, and afterwards it does, the korban tomid, after the details were given in Oil Moed, do need hefshet v'nituach, and that didn't sound right to you. And because of that, you're assuming that the oila was the oilas re'iyah, not the oilas tomid. Says the Gemara that that's not a good enough reason to assume Rabbi Shmuel says like Beis Shammai. We just saw Rabbi Yosi Aglili explicitly says the Omar, oilo shekrivu Yisrael b'midbar, oilas tomid havoi. He says explicitly it was the oilas tomid. And indeed, meikara loy boye hefshet v'nituach ulebasayif boye hefshet v'nituach, and he had no problem. We'll soon see in the Brayso, Rabbi Yosi Aglili is going to say this explicitly. We don't have an issue with the fact that before you know the details, you did what you understood then, and the details will be developed later, and then you'll know how to do it from then on. It's not a question. So it could be that Rabbi Shmuel holds like Beis Hillel, and he says they brought an oilas tomid. The Tanya we saw in the Brayso, Rabbi Yosi Aglili Omer, oila shekrivu Yisrael b'midbar, einot te'una hefshet v'nituach. He said explicitly that oila that was brought in the midbar at first didn't need hefshet v'nituach, because we didn't know about hefshet v'nituach. Lefi she'ein hefshet v'nituach elo me'ol moed ve'elech, because the requirement and the knowledge of hefshet v'nituach was only given to us in the Oil Moed, which is like Rabbi Shmuel said before, that the details were not given with the generalizations themselves. So he says explicitly, I don't have a problem with that. So Rabbi Yosi Aglili in the Brayso didn't have a problem with that. There's a good chance Rabbi Shmuel didn't have a problem with that. How can you say Rabbi Shmuel says like Beis Shammai? Says the Gemara, you're right, Somi mikan Rabbi Shmuel. That not like Abaye said initially, we're actually removing Rabbi Shmuel from the list, and there's only two Tanoim. There's only Beis Shammai and Rebbe Loza, who say that it was the oilas re'iyah. Rabbi Shmuel could well hold it was an oilas tomid, like Beis Hillel, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Yosi Aglili. Continues the Gemara, Boyer Reb Chizda, Haikra Heichaksiv. This pasuk that we saw, we mentioned it before, Vayishlach es nari b'nei Yisrael, Vayalu oilois, Vayizbechu zvachim shlomim l'Hashem porim. So the question is, how are we going to read this pasuk? It says, Vayishlach es nari b'nei Yisrael, Vayalu oilois, Vayalu oilois. What would that mean? Because the pasuk says they brought korban oilois. What oilois? Which animal was it? We know what type of korban it was. It was an oila. Which animal? Kvasim. It may have been lambs. Vayizbechu zvachim shlomim l'Hashem. And then the pasuk says Vayizbechu zvachim shlomim l'Hashem porim. Porim are bulls. Because what the Gemara is now addressing is that the pasuk says Vayalu oilois. They brought oilois. Also, Vayizbechu zvachim shlomim. They brought shlomim l'Hashem. Porim, bulls. Bulls is just the shlomim were bulls, or maybe the oilos were also bulls, and maybe the oilos were not bulls. Maybe the oilos were lambs. That's the question. Is it Vayalu oilos kvasim, lambs, Vayizbechu zvachim shlomim l'Hashem, porim? Only the shlomim were the bulls? Or Dilma maybe not. Idi v'idi porim hava. Both of them were bulls. Vayalu oilos and Vayizbechu zvachim shlomim l'Hashem, and both the oilos and the shlomim were porim, were bulls. Says the Gemara l'may nafkamina. What's the difference? Whatever they did then, they did then. They did that before Matan Torah, at Sinai, in the Midbar. Like, what relevance? Why would it make a difference? Says the Gemara, Marzutra Omar lepisuk tamim. You have to know where to put the comma. That's in English, that's how we would say. We know in the Torah there's tamim. There's a certain way it's read. And there are some tamim, trop. There are some tamim which are in the place of commas, and others not. So you have to know, is it Vayalu oilois, comma? And then Vayizbechu zvachim shlomim l'Hashem porim, because the oilos were not porim, or no, Vayalu oilos Vayizbechu zvachim shlomim l'Hashem, and both of them were porim, and you don't put a comma, a period in between. So you have to know where to put the tamim. Rabbi Chabrei Derelva Omar lo oimer harei olai oilo ka'oilo she'ekrivu Yisrael b'midbar. The difference will be, what happens if somebody says, I'm committing myself to bring an oilo, the same oilo that was brought in the midbar. So now I need to know what oilo they brought, because I need to know what I committed myself to. Was it porim hava or kvasim hava? Was it bulls or was it a lamb? What do I need to bring? Says the Gemara Teiku, we have no way of resolving that. We have to let this question stand for now. And in Yirtzeh Hashem, in the next shiur, we're going to continue from here.